Welcome to History Love, where we explore the stories, people, and events that shaped our world. Let's dive into the past and uncover history's most fascinating moments. The War of 1812, a nation forged in fire. United Kingdom, United States history. June 18, 1812 to February 17, 1815. The drums of war echoed across the Atlantic as two great powers, the United States and Great Britain, hurtled toward conflict. What began as a battle over maritime rights would soon ignite a war that tested the young American republic's resolve. By the time the smoke cleared, the world would see a nation that refused to bow, a nation that would define its place in history. The sparks that lit the fire. The War of 1812 was born in the shadows of European chaos. Across the seas, the titanic struggle between France and Britain raged on. The French Revolutionary Wars had bled into the Napoleonic Wars, and with them the ambitions of empires collided. America, caught in the tempest, sought prosperity and neutrality, its ships sailing between warring nations, filling its coffers with the spoils of global trade. But Britain, the unchallenged ruler of the waves, would not allow it. They wielded the rule of 1756 like a blade, severing American trade where it suited their needs. The Royal Navy prowled the seas, intercepting American ships, enforcing laws that bent only in favor of the crown. It was a power play, a message: you may be independent but you are not free. Yet the United States was not so easily tamed. A rising storm. The embers of resentment grew hotter as Britain tightened its grip. The decisive British victory at Trafalgar 1805 only emboldened their blockade of French ports, forcing Napoleon to retaliate. With his Berlin Decree 1806, the French emperor forbade any nation from trading with Britain, a direct strike at American neutrality. Britain countered with the Orders in Council 1807, demanding that neutral ships first pass through English ports before trading with France. Caught between two giants, American merchants faced an impossible choice: comply with Britain and risk the wrath of Napoleon, or defy the crown and become the hunted. And then came the final insult. The Royal Navy's ruthless policy of impressment, abducting sailors from American ships and forcing them into British service, became an unforgivable sin. Thousands of American citizens were taken, stripped of their freedom, forced to serve a foreign king. But it was the Chesapeake Affair 1807 that shook the nation. Off the coast of Virginia, the HMS Leopard bore down on the USS Chesapeake. The British demanded the surrender of alleged deserters. When the Americans refused, the Leopard opened fire. The Chesapeake, unprepared, fell under the barrage and 4 sailors were taken, 3 of them American citizens. It was an act of war in all but name. The road to war. President Thomas Jefferson, determined to resist without bloodshed, wielded economic power as his weapon. With the Embargo Act of 1807, he sought to cripple Britain and France by cutting off American trade. But the embargo strangled America's own economy instead, stirring resentment within its borders. As Jefferson left office, the next president, James Madison, inherited a nation on the brink. The war drums beat louder. In Congress, the voices of the war hawks, led by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, called for action, for vengeance, for war. On June 18, 1812, the United States made its choice. War had come. The stage was set. The young republic would fight, not just for its rights but for its very identity. And in the fire of battle, a nation would rise. The war draws near, a nation on the edge. The Embargo Act, designed as a weapon of economic warfare, became a slow poison, suffocating American merchants and crippling its own economy far more than it did Britain or France. Desperation bred defiance as smugglers and traders ignored the law, slipping goods across borders in the dead of night. Seeing the failure of his grand strategy, President Thomas Jefferson left office in 1809 with a reluctant compromise: the Non-Intercourse Act, a revised measure that barred trade only with Britain and France. Yet this too proved toothless, and soon it was replaced by Macon's Bill No. 2, 1810. The new law was a game of high-stakes diplomacy. America would trade with all nations, but if either Britain or France lifted their restrictions, the U.S. would cut off trade with the other. In August 1810, Napoleon, ever the master of deception, hinted that American ships would be spared from his Berlin and Milan decrees. It was a calculated move, and President James Madison, desperate for a resolution, took the bait. By November, he reinstated trade restrictions against Britain, drawing the nation ever closer to the abyss of war. A battle beyond the seas. Britain's defiance was not simply the arrogance of empire, it was economic survival. British merchants and shipowners, wary of growing American competition, demanded the Royal Navy protect their trade at all costs. To them, the United States was not an equal power but a rebellious colony that refused to know its place. To Americans, it was a humiliation they could no longer endure. But the conflict was no longer confined to ships and tariffs. The frontier boils over. Beyond the settled lands, in the vast forests of the Northwest Territory, another storm brewed. As American settlers pushed westward, indigenous nations fought to preserve their lands. In their resistance, two Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa the Prophet, rose as symbols of defiance, rallying warriors to their cause. Though the British commander of Upper Canada, Major General Isaac Brock, had orders to avoid stirring tensions, the settlers in the frontier saw British influence in every war-painted warrior that took up arms. Rumors swirled, whispers of British agents supplying weapons, stirring rebellion in the shadows. In November 1811, Indiana's territorial governor, William Henry Harrison, led an army to crush the resistance. At the Battle of Tippecanoe, Prophet's town was set ablaze, its warriors scattered. Yet, instead of breaking their will, the flames only solidified their cause. With their lands under siege, many tribes saw only one path forward: alliance with the British. To American settlers, the battle was proof of British treachery. If the frontier was ever to be safe, Britain's grip on Canada had to be broken. But to the Canadians, these rising tensions were not about frontier security but something far more dangerous: an American war of conquest. The war hawks seized the moment. In November 1811, with tensions at their peak, President Madison called Congress into session. In the halls of power, the voices of war echoed loudest in the South and West. Leading them was Henry Clay, the newly elected Speaker of the House, a war hawk ready to strike back against British arrogance. By June 1, 1812, the decision could no longer be delayed. Madison sent his war message to Congress, and on June 18, war was declared. But the decision was far from unanimous. In the House, the vote was 79 to 49. In the Senate, it barely passed, 19 to 13. The nation was divided. New England seafarers opposed the war, fearing devastation to their trade, while the West and South rallied behind the call to arms. Federalists accused war advocates of seeking expansion under the guise of protecting maritime rights. But for many it was not about land, it was about honor. The British had shackled American trade, seized its sailors, armed its enemies, and insulted its sovereignty. That was reason enough. Across the country the war cry took shape: free trade and sailors' rights. And with that the young republic marched toward war. A war that could not be stopped. The war drums had sounded, but in London the decision to fight left British leaders stunned. The empire was already locked in a desperate struggle against Napoleon, and a second front in North America was the last thing Britain wanted. Yet even as America prepared for battle, the tides of British policy had begun to shift. On May 11, 1812, an assassin's bullet cut down Prime Minister Spencer Perceval, throwing the British government into turmoil. In his place, a more moderate Tory leadership emerged under Lord Liverpool, one that viewed American grievances with fresh eyes. The powerful West Indies planters, who had long suffered under the restrictions placed on U.S. trade, demanded change. Meanwhile, a deepening recession gripped Britain, forcing the government to reconsider its economic warfare. And so, in an act that might have changed history, the Orders in Council were repealed on June 16, 1812, just 2 days before America declared war. But the message would take a month to cross the Atlantic, arriving far too late to stop the march toward conflict. Some would call it a lost opportunity for peace. Yet, in truth, war had long been inevitable. The real spark had not been tariffs or trade, but pride, honor, and sovereignty. Britain's brutal policy of impressment remained unchanged. The bloodshed on the frontier had not ceased. The grievances ran deeper than a single law, and neither nation was willing to back down. The war that neither side truly wanted had begun. A war of overconfidence and chaos. Neither side was truly ready for war. The Americans, swept up in the fever of nationalism, believed victory was inevitable. William Eustis, the U.S. Secretary of War, declared that Canada would fall without bloodshed. Henry Clay boasted that Kentucky's militia alone could seize Montreal. And Thomas Jefferson imagined an unstoppable march, first to Quebec, then Halifax, then the final expulsion of Britain from North America. But war is never that simple. The British, preoccupied with Napoleon's conquests, viewed the American conflict as a mere distraction. Canada was left woefully undersupplied, its defenses stretched thin. Yet, in the shadows of scarcity, a powerful force was gathering: British regulars, hardened Canadian militia, and the warriors of Tecumseh's Confederation. The first blunders: the fall of Detroit. In July 1812, Michigan Territorial Governor William Hull led U.S. forces into Canada from Detroit, convinced he would be met with open arms. Instead, he found an unyielding enemy. Isaac Brock, the British commander of Upper Canada, and Tecumseh, the Shawnee war chief, outmaneuvered Hull at every turn. By August 16, panic overtook Hull. The sight of Tecumseh's warriors, fierce and unrelenting, was enough to break his nerve. Without a single shot fired, he surrendered Detroit. Even Brock's own officers were stunned at the ease of victory. The loss sent shockwaves through the American frontier. The Northwest Territory became a hunting ground for British-led raids. Hull's replacement, William Henry Harrison, struggled to hold onto scattered outposts as Indian forces swept through the region, leaving American settlers in terror. Disaster on the northeastern front. While the British were vastly outnumbered, American incompetence balanced the scales. Along the northeastern border, General Henry Dearborn was tasked with leading an attack on Montreal, but the New England militias, many of them sympathetic to Britain, refused to fight. Further west, Stephen Van Rensselaer crossed the Niagara River to assault Queenston on October 13, 1812. Once again, Brock rallied his troops in defense. Though he was cut down in the battle, his men held firm, repelling the American forces. Meanwhile, U.S. General Alexander Smith launched his own invasion attempts, each one a humiliating disaster. By the end of 1812, American morale was in tatters. A turning tide on the water. On land, America floundered. But at sea it found its first heroes. The fledgling U.S. Navy, though vastly outnumbered, proved more formidable than the British expected. In a series of single-ship duels, American captains like Isaac Hull, Stephen Decatur, and William Bainbridge commanded heavy frigates that stunned the Royal Navy. British vessels were sent to the ocean's depths, their losses shaking the Admiralty. But Britain, the undisputed master of the seas, would not be humiliated for long. The Royal Navy's answer was swift. A full-scale blockade. By 1814, British warships choked American ports from New England to Georgia. Trade ground to a halt, and U.S. frigates were trapped in their harbors. Meanwhile, British Admiral George Cockburn launched raids along the Chesapeake Bay, striking deep into the American coast. America strikes back. The battles of 1813. Despite early failures, 1813 brought new hope. On September 10, 1813, Oliver Hazard Perry led an American fleet to victory in the Battle of Lake Erie, shattering the British naval presence in the region. His famous message echoed through history. "We have met the enemy and they are ours." With control of the lake, Harrison advanced. On October 5, at the Battle of the Thames, his forces crushed the retreating British and their native allies. Tecumseh fell in battle, and with him, his confederation crumbled. The British Indigenous alliance was shattered, but the flames of war burned on. The war turns ugly. As winter approached, the conflict took a dark turn. American forces, retreating from the Niagara Peninsula, torched the Canadian village of Newark. The British response was swift and brutal. General Gordon Drummond led a counterattack, setting American towns ablaze in retaliation. Buffalo was left in ruins, its people fleeing from the inferno. Meanwhile, in the South, war erupted among the Creek Nation. A faction known as the Red Sticks rose up against American expansion, turning the frontier into another battleground. The war was no longer about territory or trade. It had become something far worse, a fight for survival. And the worst was yet to come. The tide turns, 1814, in the fight for survival. By 1814 the war had transformed. The ineffective American officers of the past were now replaced by battle-hardened leaders, Jacob Brown, Winfield Scott, and Andrew Jackson, who would redefine the course of the conflict. The Southern Theater. Jackson crushes the Creeks. The war in the South reached a climax on March 27, 1814, when Andrew Jackson led his forces against the Red Stick Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. The battle was a massacre. Jackson's men, supported by Cherokee and Creek allies, annihilated the Red Stick warriors, effectively ending the Creek War. With this victory, Jackson cemented his reputation as a ruthless commander and secured vast native lands for American settlement. The Niagara Campaign, brutal battles and bloodshed. As the Americans refocused on Canada, General Jacob Brown crossed the Niagara River and captured Fort Erie. The British, under Brig General Phineas Riall, moved to counter the invasion. On July 5, 1814, Winfield Scott's regulars crushed Riall's forces at the Battle of Chippewa, a rare and decisive American victory. But momentum shifted when the U.S. Navy failed to support Brown's advance. Forced to retreat, the Americans clashed with the British again at Lundy's Lane on July 25. It was the bloodiest battle of the war, a brutal close-quarters fight lasting deep into the night. Each side suffered over 800 casualties. Though the battle ended in a stalemate, it shattered both armies. Brown's men retreated to Fort Erie, while the British, too battered to continue, pulled back. The British strike back, invasion from the north. With Napoleon defeated in Europe, Britain could finally send seasoned troops to America. That summer, Canadian Governor-General George Prevost led a large invasion force down the Lake Champlain corridor into New York. His plan? Seize Plattsburgh and cut New England off from the rest of the United States. But on September 11, 1814, the British fleet under Captain George Downey met disaster at the Battle of Plattsburgh Bay. Commodore Thomas Macdonough's American squadron scored a stunning victory, forcing the British to retreat back to Canada. The invasion had failed. The burning of Washington, a capital in flames. The war took a shocking turn when British Admiral Alexander Cochrane launched a raid on Chesapeake Bay. General Robert Ross led British troops ashore, quickly defeating American militia at Bladensburg on August 24, 1814. The road to Washington, D.C. lay open. That night, British troops burned the United States Capitol, the Executive Mansion, later renamed the White House, and other government buildings. The destruction was justified as retaliation for the American burning of York, Toronto, the year before. President James Madison and his wife Dolly Madison fled the city as flames engulfed the capital. The defense of Baltimore, the birth of a national anthem. After Washington, the British set their sights on Baltimore. On September 12 to 14, they launched a land and sea assault, but the Americans stood firm. At North Point, militia repelled the British Army and killed General Ross. Meanwhile, Fort McHenry endured a massive naval bombardment but did not fall. Watching the battle from a British ship, Francis Scott Key witnessed the American flag still flying over Fort McHenry. Inspired, he wrote a poem, The Star-Spangled Banner, which would later become the national anthem of the United States. With Ross dead and Fort McHenry holding strong, the British abandoned their Chesapeake campaign and turned south, to New Orleans. The Hartford Convention, Federalists on the wrong side of history. Meanwhile, opposition to the war was brewing in New England. The region's Federalists, furious at how the conflict had crippled commerce, convened in Hartford, Connecticut from December 15, 1814, to January 5, 1815. Though their resolutions were moderate, the convention's mere existence made them look disloyal, especially as news of Jackson's victory at New Orleans spread across the country. The Federalist Party, already in decline, would never recover from the stain of appearing unpatriotic. As the war entered its final chapter, the battle for New Orleans would determine whether the United States ended in triumph or humiliation. The final stages of the war and its aftermath. Even as the war raged on, diplomatic efforts to end the conflict had begun. The Treaty of Ghent, diplomacy over war. Shortly after the war began, Tsar Alexander I of Russia offered to mediate peace talks between Britain and the United States. Though London initially refused, British leaders were open to negotiations, especially because Napoleon remained a major threat in Europe. However, by 1814, with Napoleon defeated, Britain's war priorities shifted. Peace talks began in Ghent, modern Belgium, in August 1814. The British stalled negotiations, hoping for a decisive victory in America that would strengthen their bargaining position. But after the American victories at Plattsburgh and Baltimore, the British realized a prolonged war was futile. The Duke of Wellington, Britain's most respected military leader, advised that no further conquests were possible. Both sides made significant concessions. Americans abandoned demands for an end to British impressment. Since the European War was over, the practice had already ceased. The British dropped their goals of altering the Canadian boundary and establishing an Indian barrier state in the northwest. On December 24, 1814, the two sides signed the Treaty of Ghent, restoring relations to the status quo ante bellum, the state of affairs before the war. While it resolved none of the major issues that had caused the war, it officially ended hostilities between Britain and the United States. The Battle of New Orleans, a war already won. Unaware that a peace treaty had been signed, British forces under General Edward Pakenham launched a massive assault on New Orleans on January 8, 1815. They were met by General Andrew Jackson's unconventional army, a mix of regular soldiers, frontiersmen, free African Americans, Choctaw warriors, and even pirates led by Jean Lafitte. Jackson's forces inflicted a stunning defeat, killing over 2,000 British troops, including Pakenham, while suffering fewer than 100 American casualties. Although the battle had no impact on the treaty, it transformed public perception of the war. Many Americans, unaware of the details of the peace negotiations, believed New Orleans had won the war. The aftermath, a new national identity. The war's domestic divisions had weakened the American war effort, and New England's opposition to the conflict, as seen in the Hartford Convention, had nearly fractured the Union. However, after the war, a surge of patriotism swept the nation, reshaping the country's future. The United States gained a new sense of national unity. Many Americans viewed the war as a second war of independence, reinforcing their belief that the U.S. had defied Britain once again. American expansion accelerated. The war ended Britain's influence among Native American tribes in the Northwest Territory, allowing for unchecked U.S. expansion westward. In the South, the Creek War's aftermath led to massive land cessions, paving the way for white settlers and eventually leading to the U.S. acquisition of Florida from Spain in 1821. Canada's national identity strengthened. Though Americans had hoped to absorb Canada, their failed invasions reinforced Canadian loyalty to Britain and helped shape Canada's own independent identity. The legacy of the War of 1812. Though the war was militarily inconclusive, it had profound long-term effects. The U.S. and Britain entered a new era of peace. The Treaty of Ghent included arbitration clauses, setting a precedent for diplomatic conflict resolution. The U.S. and Britain would never again go to war, leading to the world's longest unfortified border between the two nations. The Federalist Party collapsed. Their opposition to the war, especially through the Hartford Convention, made them look disloyal. This marked the rise of Democratic-Republican dominance in U.S. politics. The U.S. military gained prestige. The success of the U.S. Navy and Jackson's defense of New Orleans proved that America could stand against global powers. Though the War of 1812 ended in a stalemate, the United States emerged stronger, more unified, and more confident in its future. Thanks for joining us on this journey through history. If you love this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to History Love. Together, let's keep the love for history alive. See you in the next chapter.